I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and I'll bring him to the stage shortly. His name is Curt Shopping. Curt is a private practice radiologist with the Radiology Associates of North Texas and the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Curt is the chair of our reimbursement committee, and Curt is also the advisor to the RVS Update Committee, the RUC. In his role in the RUC is probably how many of you know him. In fact, it's what he talked about last year. What many don't know about Curt is that he is also an expert in hospital outpatient radiology payment policy through a schedule called the Hospital Outpatient Prospective Payment System, where he leads our efforts in that regard. I've asked Curt to talk about that today, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming Curt to the stage. Curt.
Nice to meet you. Hope you get mine. Yeah. But what wasn't you?
I'm glad you enjoyed that. So, as you're familiar, and as Zeke mentioned, some of my prior presentations have been about RVUs, and usually why you're getting more or less, usually less, than what you would like. And today we're going to talk about HOPS. Now, that's the Hospital Outpatient Prospective Payment Schedule. This is a highly technical, perhaps a bit arcane fee schedule for hospitals. Now, for clarity, when a radiology group performs a service in the hospital and they submit that claim, they are submitting it for the professional RVUs. That's that Medicare physician fee schedule that we're familiar with. That's the RUC. Now, the HOPS covers the technical component for the hospitals. That's who owns the equipment, the technologists, the supplies. Now, there's very few people who really understand HOPS. I'm not necessarily sure I'm one of them, but it still remains an important fee schedule, and it's become more important, because of old legislation and regs and new legislation and regulations. So it's best to compare it to something that we're all really familiar with, and that's the EULA, the End User License Agreement. These are those blocks of text that you click next, 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 okay, I'm ready to play. Now, in this text are the details of your relationship and responsibilities to each other. There's the user of maybe the software, the stuff, and the provider. And these details have consequences, just like HOPS. So we're going to take a look at our relationship with HOPS. And this is how HOPS works, mostly. So hospitals report costs for individual procedures, like a CT chest. Those costs are aggregated across all the hospitals across the country, and then you take a geometric mean for those costs, and that's what CT chest is. Now, when you start aggregating it across multiple procedures, other CTs, other MRs, and those geometric means, we start bundling those geometric means into groups called APCs, or ambulatory payment classifications. So when a hospital reports on a claim, they don't say, I did a chest CT, they say, I did an APC3, and you're paid what that bundled payment is for that source. This is a prospective fee schedule as opposed to the Medicare physician fee schedule, which is retrospective and resource-based. And this is a key distinction. So that basic structure of HOPS is really sufficient to answer our task today. But there's a lot of details in HOPS that we're not going to cover, and there's a couple reasons why. Now, do you or anybody in here, you can show of hands if you want, actually read the text in those end-user license agreements? Of course you don't. It's painfully and terribly and tortuously boring. So you really get two outcomes. One, you're either going to go to sleep, or two, it's going to drive you to drink. Now, and I'll give you an example. Cost, as it were, cost is a CMS-defined concept. It is not actually the cost as the hospitals experience them. Right? Right. So welcome to payment policy. This is where logic and common sense are on permanent vacation with their friend fairness. So we know the details matter. So let's look at we're going to look at the more practical applications of why HOPS matters to everybody in this room, whether you're private practice, you're academic, whether you're inpatient or outpatient, why how hospitals get paid matter to you. And the first one is that HOPS and the Medicare physician fee schedule have started to converge, and that's because of the Deficit Reduction Act. So the Deficit Reduction Act mandates that payments in outpatient imaging centers get the technical reimbursement that's the lower of HOPS or MPFS. Now, 13 years ago when this legislation was passing, these fee schedules are so far apart that this never really entered in a practical consideration. Now, because of downward trends in HOPS, the hospital technical fees are going to threaten or already cap the reimbursement for the technical component for outpatient imaging centers that have nothing to do with the hospital. And so those codes on the left, or the radiological right, are the ones that are currently capped. Those other codes are at risk. And if, say, in 2017, on a quarterly basis, these caps cost the House of Radiology about $13 million. If trends in HOPS continue, as they have, you're going to look at annual risk to the House of Radiology in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's by 2021 or 2022. And so this risk goes beyond just Medicare payments, because it depends on how your other contracts are worded and exactly what your exposures are. And this brings us to site-neutral payments. Now, Medicare has been inching towards site-neutral payments over time, and they do that in two ways. Right now, it's for new hospital imaging centers or hospital outpatient departments on campuses, but it can potentially affect all payments eventually. And you have to respect their logic just a little bit. Why, as a payer, do I want to pay a different rate for a chest CT just because the site of service is different? I would also suggest that this logic means that Medicare has never been to the airport and found out how expensive a tuna sandwich is there compared to everywhere else. So I'll give you two examples. First one, we look at the hospital technical payment for a breast ultrasound, $112. But in a new hospital-based imaging center, that technical payment has a site-neutral payment cut of 50% because it's going to be paid at the lower technical rate of the MPFS schedule. Alternatively, an upper extremity MRI in a hospital is reimbursed $225. That's the technical component. But due to the Deficit Reduction Act, the imaging center, who used to have $300 of reimbursement, is now capped at that hospital rate. It's effectively a 25% cut. So you see how these dual policies affect you, whether or not you're a hospital-based physician. And that brings us to Anthem. Their policy has been steering patients away from the hospital outpatient departments based on a medical necessity standard. But this pairs very nicely with their ER policy, where they will retrospectively deny payment for an ER visit when the conclusion of the visit was a non-emergent diagnosis code. And this is really just the start. More businesses and more insurers are going to put pressure on these costs. Because you have to consider who is the client for Anthem. Who's their customer? It's not patients, it's employers. They manage cost and utilization for employers. Employers must answer to shareholders and investors who want to see profits, and healthcare costs are a direct insult to those profits. So, hospital outpatient prospective payment system is the fee schedule that has been loved to be ignored, but its role in reimbursement policy has been elevated by the Deficit Reduction Act, by site-neutral policies, and private insurers. And so I put to you, what do you do with this? What can you do to answer these issues? And so I encourage you to take a role. Educate yourself on the HOPS system. We have excellent resources in the ACR. We have excellent staff, and we'll help you get up to speed so that you can now invite yourself into the hospital finance department to have these conversations. And I'll tell you why you should. 3 things. Half of hospitals in the country report costs for CT and MR incorrectly, based on the rules as laid out in HOPS. It's not ideal, but it costs all of us money now. 15% of codes that include contrast, or should include contrast, do not. Medicare is happy to average in those lower numbers and drop the reimbursement for all of those contrast-enhanced exams. And finally, and worst, lung cancer screening CT. When hospitals started reporting costs for lung cancer screening CT, they started reporting it as 0 because that's what they were charging patients. Medicare, instead of recognizing that it is impossible to provide a service at $0, was happy to average those dollars in, which is why the hospital payment for lung cancer screening is so poor. And then finally, you have to uncover for yourself what your risk is, your group's, your practice's risk. How are your contracts worded? What is your exposure to these policy changes? What decrease in technical can you really afford? And for those of you in the audience who are like, whew, thank you, I don't have technical. Sorry, if you have any outpatient contract that's paid on a % of collections, all of this matters to you too. So I encourage you to educate yourself, invite yourself to the party, and figure out what your risk is, because you can't plan for the future unless you know where you are today. So get active and be persistent. Thank you.